first time seeing it in the wild. Greetings everyone, how's it going? Today we are gonna play test Jammy HB versus Stealth Kate. Now because I am continuously updating this list, testing different cards and different influence spreads, I'm going to have a lot of iterations of this deck. I'm not going to create a new deck for each one. As a result, I'm not going to have any static deck list on Netrunner DB, so please don't ask me for it. If you want, you can attempt to recreate this deck based on what you see in this video. Feel free to do so. I start with a horrible opening hand. This was my mulligan hand. It had 2 agendas, a restructure, very clunky, and a Ravana, which doesn't stop the run at all. Thankfully, my opponent is not playing a very aggressive build. It's going for R&D interface, which is a rather slow way of digging through R&D. So, you might be able to get 2 accesses of R&D, but that's fine. Because it's not a burst access where my opponent can get 1 or even 2 agendas likely. The most important thing here is my opponent did not run my Jackson Howard, which was a mistake. Even though my opponent had the money, they chose not to contest the face down Jackson Howard, and as a result, I'm able to actually clear my hand of nasty agendas. I still don't draw any ice though, and this is where my first deck building mistake comes in. I have 16 ice in this deck, and I really should have 17. It's a very minute difference, 16 versus 17. It really doesn't seem like much at all, but in games like this, I really wish that I had that extra ice, because only seeing 2 ice after a couple turns and a whole turn of Jackson drawing is actually really bad news. I play a blue level here, and again, even drawing 3 cards that turn, 1 mandatory draw, 2 from the blue level, I still don't find a third piece of ice, and this is really bad for a Jammy deck. Jammy, why do I call it Jammy HB? Well, that's because I keep jamming unadvanceable stuff behind remotes. The opponent's forced to check it. If I'm not doing that in the early to mid game, I'm losing, because I'm not forcing the runner to run through my remote. Instead, now they can dictate my tempo. They are playing at the tempo, and I have to keep up with that tempo. My opponent's tempo is I have enough resources and tutors to bring out my breakers, the Switchblade, and the Ghost Runner to deal with the Sherlock that's on R&D. I wasted a lot of money raising that Sherlock when my opponent's just breaking for 2 stealth credits. I fire a beta test here because I only have drawn 3 ice so far, despite being through more than a quarter of my deck. And surprise, surprise, 2 agendas hit the bin, and my opponent immediately reaches match point. Most people would concede here. I'm not gonna lie, I really did feel like conceding here, but I'm going to hold on and see how long I can defend against my opponent for. Notice that I'm still playing against my opponent's tempo, because my opponent can threaten R&D runs very easily, either by clicking through Sherlock or by paying 2 stealth credits to get through. I need to fortify R&D further. A single Sherlock's not going to do the trick. So what I'm really looking for here is more sentries. I run 3 architects. I'm hoping to draw 1 of them so that R&D can more or less be locked out. 4 stealth credits to get through R&D is a bit too much of an ask for a stealth deck. My opponent's probably running the new Netrunner, but it's not installed yet, so I'm not worried about that just yet. In the meantime, I get an Eli, and I try to bait my opponent into running my Eli remote. But this is the tough part. When you get to match point, or rather when your opponent gets to match point, it becomes a lot easier to predict what's in the remote. My opponent here knows that if that's an agenda in the remote and he contests it and wins the contest, he wins the game. So that makes it very unlikely for me to actually attempt to sneak out an agenda here. And besides, with 2 R&D ice and 3 accesses, it's so much easier to just go for R&D, and that's exactly what my opponent does. Using Ghost Runner and Cloak, my opponent easily busts through R&D, and Mirror replenishes the Cloak credit. And at this time, I receive a Skype call, which basically tells me that I'm quite screwed. You know you're quite screwed when someone's knocking on your door and asking you, what the hell are you doing this game? Well, get this. The second Ghost Runner is back up, which means that my opponent has many more runs on R&D, and with Jackson Howard, I'm actually breaking the R&D lock, which means I cannot at any cost allow my opponent to get to R&D again. So I'm going to put my gear check ice, 1 on R&D, 1 on the remote. And there we go. With the gear check ice, hopefully my opponent doesn't siege R&D. But why wouldn't he? After taking money off Temujin, it's pretty easy for him to run R&D here, and can easily contest any ice really. My setup here is not ideal. As I mentioned, I much rather have an architect instead of this lowly quandary, but well, stealth decks make it very punishing if you don't draw your eyes in the correct order, and that's exactly what's happening. Innermost Sherlock, definitely not ideal. I'd rather have Sherlock outside and Quandary inside, but more importantly, I need to stack those code gates, stack those sentries, to make it really hard for my opponent to get through. Speaking of code gates, my opponent's using Refractor, which is a very interesting choice considering that this is after escalation and my opponent can use Houdini. I genuinely think Houdini is probably better in most situations, just because of the 6 strength code gates and the fact that your opponent has no counterplay by stacking high strength code gates. But that aside, the refractor is actually saving my opponent a bit of money, so that's good. The install cost is kind of relevant. Being able to install refractor for 0 credits is pretty good, and here's where the hell comes in. Netmarker hits the table, and this is where it gets really ludicrous. So my opponent runs Archives here, gets 4 credits from the Temujin, and uses the cloak credit to pump his Switchblade or his refractor. It doesn't matter. He's allowed to pump those breakers. He's just not allowed to break those subroutines. But he's doing that even though there's no ice, just so that he can spend that cloak credit, which he wasn't going to use that turn anyway, and load up Netmarker. So now, this new turn, my opponent has 2 stealth credits, 1 on cloak and 1 on Netmarker. And when my opponent attempts to use 2 stealth credits to break my Sherlock, he's actually getting 1 back from Netmarker. And gets a mirror credit as well on the successful run on R&D. So that's pretty good value. Then we have to ask ourselves here, is Mirror actually doing good work in this stealth deck? Can he make use of that cloak credit? Can he use it to his advantage? And he tries to. He runs my archives. He tries to get the Temujin money, and I say nope. This is your Fairchild 3.0, it's 5 strength, so it costs you 1 cloak credit, stealth credit rather, to pump the refractor. And he does that. He pumps the refractor with the cloak credit, which he got from Mirror, and that gives him a Netmarker credit, because this is a new run. That's pretty efficient. That's a pretty good play. So yes, Mirror is actually doing a bit of work here. That run on R&D actually gave him 1 stealth credit from Mirror. Pretty good. I'm still not a big fan of Mirror in a stealth deck, even with Netmarker. I don't think it pays off enough, but this guy is showing us how it's done, so props to him for that. In the meantime, I scored Vitruvius because I can. So that brings the score up to 4 against 6. Scoring a Global Food would win me the game here, but against a stealth deck, that is basically impossible. I don't run Caprice, and Ash will barely tax my opponent out, so that's not happening. My opponent goes for the Dirty Laundry on R&D. He's not going to see a lot of new cards because I only took my mandatory draw last turn, so it's going to be 2 old cards and a new card from this R&D run. Let's see what happens. He spends 2 stealth credits and gets 1 back from Netmarker and replenishes 1 using Mirror. But this time he runs HQ. He comes into my HQ and says, well, if there are no agendas in R&D, there have to be some in HQ. I res the Ravana because it only costs 3 to res, and he's able to use the cloak credit once more, generated from Mirror, to break through Ravana. So this is where the high strength ice kind of breaks down. Stealth rigs are pretty good against Glacier decks like these if you're not able to stack breakers to tax them out, and this is exactly what's happening to me. The code gates on HQ and Archives are basically preventing him from abusing the interaction between Cloak and Netmarker, but even by forcing him to by forcing him to break the ice. If the servers were empty, he can not only get Temujin money, but he can also just spend the Cloak credit and regain it using Netmarker. Anyway, yeah, so basically once the opponent gets a lot of Netmarker credits, I am kind of screwed, because if my opponent gets lots of Netmarker credits, they can break through as many sentries as they want in a single run, with so many stealth credits on Netmarker. So it's actually quite imperative for me to prevent Netmarker from snowballing out of control, like a Data Sucker. It's actually worse than Data Sucker, because unlike Sucker, you can't purge Netmarker. So those credits are there to stay until they spend them. The only way you can tax them out is to stack those sentries. Here he comes again, on R&D. That Quandary is not doing anything at all. My opponent is very poor. Very few real credits. So he's not even going to break through and access my server. What he actually did there was to headbutt the Quandary to spend a cloak credit so that he could load up the Netmarker, which is now on 3 credits. That was very smart. Again, what I needed to do there was to make all my outermost eyes spiky. Make sure that he is forced to break them, because if it's a simple end run like Vanilla or Quandary, he can just headbutt them to get a net Merker credit, which is pretty silly. So, my opponent clicks through the Fairchild here. So, he spends his entire turn to get 4 credits off Temujin and gets 1 extra credit on net Merker because he's able to use the cloak to charge up the net Merker again. So, with 4 stealth credits on net Merker and 2 cloak credits each turn, goodness me. At this point, stacking all those sentries on R&D is rather ineffective at this point. There's an Architect on R&D as well. In fact, I think there's an Architect and a Sherlock on R&D. So that's 3 sentries in a row. But he can still afford the 6 stealth credits it costs to get through all 3 sentries, and that's ridiculous. Now I attempt to bait him to running my remote here. It's Fairchild 3 into Vanilla into Eli. But by now, since my opponent has a Cerberus Lady, those barriers mean nothing. This server is not taxing at all. At this point, I'm basically resigned to my fate. And when he brought out the Inti, I know I was done for good. Because I can't find any vector of defense to tax his breakers at all. Refractor's not really taxable because it requires so few stealth credits. Lady is not taxable because now that he has Inti, he can break stuff like Vanilla for cheap. Switchblade, how do you tax it? Net Merker is so loaded right now. 4 credits is ridiculous. All I could do was to bait my opponent into that remote with a Christium Grid, which was not going to do anything on my other centrals anyway. A small victory, but still a loss in the bigger picture. What can I do here? My opponent installs a Clot. Well, fast advance out of the window. Only thing I can do right here is to sneak a Vitruvius here and hope he doesn't check it. Hopefully he thinks I'm being sneaky and goes for R&D instead, because R&D seems a lot more tempting now that I have drawn so many cards off of R&D. But nope, my opponent goes for the remote instead, smartly locks down my remote, and there's nothing I can do at this point. I'm just a sitting duck, waiting to be plucked, my feathers to be plucked, as he busts through my remote, calls my bluff, and fetches the winning Vitruvius. That was a very tragic game for my Jammy HB. So clearly that game didn't work out for me, but what I really want to talk about is my opponent's deck, which actually worked better than I thought it would. Most notably, he was using the console mirror and demonstrated to me that it definitely has potential, now that net Merker is a thing. My big issue with mirror from the moment it was released is that there's really not much reason to use the replenish credit. Most of the time you replenish your cloak credit and then you're like, okay, but I've already spent all my resources running R&D that turn. I guess I'm gonna spend my next 3 clicks drawing up, taking money. I won't be breaking another server, so I won't have use for the replenish credit. I think anyone else, please back me up, who has tested mirror will agree with me that there are very few cases where you would actually use the replenish credit. Of course, that landscape changes with net Merker. Now you actually can use that replenish credit to swap a cloak credit for a net Merker credit, which is quite important because you get 1 extra stealth credit. On your next turn, the cloak credit will refresh if you charge up your net Merker, so you get 1 extra stealth credit, compared to if you did not replenish the cloak credit, you wouldn't get the extra stealth credit on net Merker. So that's a very ingenious way of using the replenish mirror credit by transferring it to net Merker from your cloak or your lockpick or what have you. My skepticism with that is that spending a click to make an extra run just to trigger net Merker is actually quite a mediocre trade. You're not gaining credits. Well, you kind of are, but gaining 1 stealth credit is kind of not very relevant nowadays. Not very necessary. But when my opponent actually pulled off that good turn where he ran archives with a Temujin pointed at it, not only did he manage to transfer a replenish credit to net Merker, he was able to gain 4 off Temujin. So suddenly that run becomes maximum. It becomes very efficient. You're doing a lot of work in a single click compression, and that is really good. I love that. So unfortunately, I still don't think that's good enough. Astrolabe is just light years ahead of Mirror when it comes to what it does, because if you think about it, especially with smoke on the horizon, not having enough stealth credits is not really a problem anymore. I'm sure you can find enough stealth credits between Ghost Runners, Cloaks, and net Merker. What you really need is to show up your weakness to all those off-the-wall matchups, those acid spam matchups, the CTM matchups, and in those matchups, the Astrolabe is going to do way more work than the mirror will, because you probably you won't be running out of stealth credits in those matchups. In those matchups, you need answers to assets, to horizontal plays. And right now, it's, in my opinion, more important to diversify your answers against different types of corp decks as opposed to putting all your eggs in the stealth basket. Mirror does exactly that. It amplifies your strength, but I don't think it is the competitive way to go. You need to have some answers for those decks that don't really pack high strength ice like Glacier HB does. That's just my thought. Feel free to disagree, I'd like to hear from you. In any case, thanks for watching as usual, and have a good time. Happy net running. Goodbye.